Good evening to all of you. A very warm welcome to today's session. Today's distinguished lecture on by Center for Studies of Plural Society on the Mode of Integration, Multiculturalism, National Identity by Professor Tariq. I'm Azima Salim. I'll be the moderator for today's session, and a warm welcome to you, sir, along with Tanveer, sir, to this session. Before beginning to our lecture, I would like to introduce the director of Center for Plural Society, Dr. Umair Anas. Dr. Umair Anas is a director of Center for Studies of Plural Society. He was earlier associated as research fellow at the Indian Council of World Affairs, New Delhi, a think tank of India's Ministry of External Affairs. Dr. Anas received his PhD from Center for West Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi in 2015. He completed his MPhil from the same center. He presented papers at the Cambridge, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Humboldt, and Fair University, etc. He has published more than 30 papers in international journals and edited volumes and more than 200 articles in national and international media on international affairs. And he has written various articles for the think tank. A very warm welcome to you, sir, as well. Before proceeding for the lecture, I would like to give a brief introduction of about Professor Tariq Modood. Tariq Modood is a professor of sociology, politics, and public policy, and a founding director of the Bristol University Research Center for the study of ethnicity and citizenship. Following fellowship at Nuffield College, Oxford, and the University of Manchester, Dr. Modood became a senior research fellow at the Policy Study Institute from 1993 to 1997. As a leading expert in the field of multiculturalism and public policy, Dr. Modood has contributed widely to important research projects. As a British Asian Muslim, he has adopted a wider European approach to multiculturalism, and his work largely focuses on the politics of being Muslim in Britain and the West in general, and its relation to the theory and policy of multiculturalism. As a result, he has worked closely with the British government to try and lessen the gaps in multicultural Britain. He is the co-founding editor of the international journal Ethnicities, and his publications include Multiculturalism, Politics, Racism, Ethnicity, and Muslims in Britain, published in 2005. The second publication is Multiculturalism, A Civic Idea, 2007. Still Not Easy Being British, Struggle for Multicultural Citizenship, 2010, and Essays on Secularism and Multiculturalism, 2019. A very warm welcome to you, sir. We are looking forward to for your lecture. Before going further, I would like to give a brief introduction about today's chair, Professor Tanweer Fazal. Professor Fazal is a professor of sociology at University of Hyderabad, specializes in sociology of nationalism, community formation, and identification with specific focus on their implications on discourse of rights and entitlements. His research has a strong elements of public policy orientation that involves rigorous analysis of existing policy instruments while suggesting new modes of interventions. Fazal was associate professor at Center for the Study of Social System, Jawaharlal Nehru University, at the Nelson Mandela Center for Peace and Conflict Resolution, Jamia Millia Islamia, from 2006 to 2014. He has been a research consultant with the Prime Minister's High Level Committee, Sector Committee 2006, wherein he worked specifically on status stratification with particular reference to the OBCs among the Muslims of India. Fazal has been an associate fellow at the Delhi Policy Group, member of the International Editorial Advisory Board of the journal South Asian History and Culture, and was an ex officio member of the Planning Commission's Working Group on the Empowerment of Minority for the 11th Five-Year Plan. He is the author of Nation, State, and Minority Rights in India, Comparative Perspectives of Muslim and Sikh Identity, published in 2015, Minority Nationalism in South Asia, published in 2020 by Routledge, London, and The Minority Conundrum Living in Majoritarian Times, published in 2020 by Penguin, Delhi. A very warm welcome to you, Professor Fazal. And Before we start with the lecture, I would like to call the director of CSPS to give a brief introduction about this organization, and then we can proceed with the lecture. Over to you, Dr. Anas.
Thank you very much, Azima Salim, for this introduction and opening the session. And first of all, I should say I'm feeling so much honored, encouraged by the presence of Professor Tariq Modood and for his agreeing to give this distinguished lecture for our organization. So let me welcome you, sir, on behalf of the entire CSPS team and all students and scholars who have been benefiting from your writings to work on the modern politics, secularism, multiculturalism, and all other issues. And let me say like this organization, when we started thinking about this organization, the primary question which were motivating us was there has been a kind of discussion in our community, in society, and there is a kind of little acknowledgement of the fact that the societies are gradually and increasingly becoming multicultural and plural, and they are going to be like that. Every country which was not having more than one ethnic group, more than one language, today they are crowded by so many identities, so many languages, so many people, so many races. So I don't think that there is any geography left in the world where which we can call as monoethnic or single language country. Sometime we call the United States as melting pot, and we use different expressions for this change. And amid this change, we have seen many tensions, many discussions, how we are going to accept these changes and how we are going to shape our politics and our social, new social values and norms. So in the wake of these changes, there has been a tensionful relations between what we call as the local population, the native population versus the population which has newly arrived in these countries. So we have created terms like the migrants, the diaspora, and the native population versus different, and new discussions and new debates are emerging out of these changes. So in the Muslim societies as well, I find it interestingly that many Muslim societies have not lived with these kind of changes, and they have lived with the Muslim majority population. So they also have not experienced that kind of change for a long time. But today they are seeing, they are observing, whether they are going to Europe or they are working in the Gulf countries or they are living in India or in maybe Asian countries. So there is more and more exposure to multicultural trends and plural trends. So in this context, we found it interesting that we should invest efforts and intellectual efforts to study these phenomena and to understand how we can understand these things, these changes, and how can we make the societies, the governments, and stakeholders convinced with these changes and accept these realities that the change is coming, and accordingly we start evolving new social norms for these things. And that is the core philosophical guidance which on which we wanted to work, and that is why we carefully chose this name, Center for Study of Plural Societies, so that we can acknowledge the fact that societies are going to be plural, and we have to live with it, and we have to learn about it, and we have to find futuristic understanding for these more and more plural societies. So this is the basic idea on which we are trying to work, and we are interacting with our scholars, and we are also guiding students and interns, and we are encouraging similar themes for our writings, for our thesis, for our research. So we are investing so many efforts in this direction. And I'm so honored that you, as a leading scholar of multiculturalism, have shown the path of how to research, how to study these things. And everyone who is working on this kind of changes, multiculturalism and pluralism, they have benefited from your writings. So it was a wonderful opportunity that we should have, and we must have invited you for this distinguished lecture. And we are so honored that you did not even ask us why and where, and you immediately accepted this our invitation. So we felt so much encouraged by your accepting this invitation. And Dr. Tanweer Fazal in India has been associated and has been working on similar themes. He has been working on nation state and how nation states have been understood and misunderstood, and how minorities and different communities, how nation states have adopted minorities, and how minorities have appropriated nation states in their mindset. So his books and his writings have shown these relations and these interactions with enough field work and enough studies. So he is the right person to lead this session today and to open this program. So I requested him to chair this session so that you both can make a very useful, very productive session. So I would not take much of your time, and I will open the session. I will request Professor Tanweer Fazal to formally take over the session and start the proceeding. Thank you very much once again, everyone.
Thank you, Omar, and thanks Center for the Study of Plural Societies for hosting this very interesting and very important discussion. I should also thank Azima for doing half of my job of introducing Professor Tariq Modood. I must also be very thankful to Omar and the Center for the Study of Plural Societies for creating a situation in which I could interact with Professor Tariq Modood, of whose writings I have been following for a long time, but rarely have we had any occasion to meet face to face. This is the best we can afford now in pandemic times. The theme for today's lecture is something extremely close to both Professor Tariq Modood's heart as well as mine. And I think it's also the most topical theme to be discussed today in India or in the world. India definitely is passing through that period of crisis of national integration, of questions about aggressive nationalism, of the importance of multiculturalism and multicultural rights, the question of citizenship, which we have also witnessed very recently, how some of the subtle questions of Indian political life have been reopened in a completely different direction. If Assam and the NRC experience is to be referred to, the whole citizenship question itself has gone through another set of crises altogether. Professor Tariq Modood has worked endlessly on these questions, particularly on the question about accommodation and integration, and the crisis of secularism, as it many times it has been referred to. Professor Modood would argue that it is a crisis actually, which has emerged because of the presence of multiculturalism, the demand of multiculturalism, and much precipitated by the Muslim presence in Western Europe. We have at the back of our mind many such incidents which make this question extremely important one. We have some years back, the Charlie Hebdo, and then the response of the French state extremely aggressively addressing that question. Then we have had a series of other kinds of issues. The issue of course, the headscarf continues to trouble trigger public debate in France or in other parts of Western Europe. And similarly, we have had very recently in France the assassination of the French teacher, and then how the French president as well as the public opinion, the dominant public opinion, responded to it. Professor Modood, of course, would address many of these questions in his talk, I believe. But the most interesting thing which which emerges from this theme is the whole idea of multicultural nationalism, which Professor Tariq Modood has been arguing for. And what is this makes things very interesting as well, because so far we have known how nationalism acquires a monocultural or unicultural character, and whether we can think of a possibility of a multicultural nationalism which doesn't threaten the sustenance of the state itself. Otherwise, we have seen other ideas of multinationalism, etc., which are usually looked at with certain kind of suspicion from the state makers or state builders. So, you warmly welcome Professor Modood, and we are all very keen to listen to you and your ideas. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to have been invited, and thank you all for your generous introductions. As Dr. Anas said, I actually accepted the invitation quite quickly because I'm always pleased to be able to engage with Indian publics, Indian scholars, and Indian debates. Not that I extensively do so, but my family, my ancestors, lived in Delhi and northern India for hundreds of years before they left as part of the Pakistan movement and the founding of Pakistan. So I feel that I'm part of an Indian heritage. Unfortunately, the Indian government doesn't think so, and I have quite serious problems in trying to get a visa when I'm invited to conferences to India or when I want to just visit India. So Zoom actually is a great opportunity for me to increase my engagement with Indian research and Indian debates and thinking, such as your center. So thank you for the invitation, and I'm pleased to be here. So to get started, I'll share the screen. It says here, host disabled participant screen sharing. So you'll have to give me the opportunity to share the screen. My lecture is on multiculturalism and its relation to integration and national identity. This topic has, as it's already been made clear in the last few minutes, has become very important in many countries, such as the US, Canada, Australia, and Western Europe, including Britain. Namely, countries that experienced significant migration from former colonies and the global South more generally after the Second World War onwards, such that those migrations and their children and grandchildren are now citizens of those countries. This raises the question of what equal citizenship means in the context of this post-colonial, ethno-racial, and ethno-religious context. And so that's what my lecture is about. So first of all, understanding integration. So I think that integration presupposes difference, i.e., that there is some integration work to do. And it arises in the context of relations between citizens and citizens, as well as citizens and their polity or state or countries. And the question arises about what is the relationship between citizens and some form of ethnic, racial, religious, or a combination of these things difference. because that raises the issue that people have a certain kind of identity that is important for their social location and their social opportunities and interactions. It's important for politics, and therefore it relates in some way or other to their citizenship. And it should relate to their citizenship, though of course there are different ways, and some of the ways are very negative, like, you know, racial discrimination or religious discrimination. I think we have to understand identity in two dimensions. What I've got here on the slide is from the outside in and from the inside out. So take the first one, from the outside in. So I understand this as negative difference. This is when other people say to you, you are different. They single you out. They create an us for themselves and a them for you. You are othered. Perhaps you're told you don't belong or that you're inferior, but you are given an identity. And the classical example of this is a racial identity. When people, for instance, when Europeans went to Africa, to West Africa, and Africans were told they were black, they didn't know they were black. They just thought they were different kinds of people, the Ashanti and people in the Kingdom of Benin and so on. But an outsider gave them a single identity imposed from the outside. But that doesn't exhaust what we mean by identity when it comes to difference, because people have their own sense of identity from the inside out, as I call it. Again, the example in West Africa is that all the people there would have had their own identities, their identities to do with tribes and kingdoms, religions, various kinds of social and political locations. And sometimes the inside out identity can be built upon the outside identity. We see this again most clearly in the case of racial identity or racialization and the African American response to it in the last half century or 3/4 of a century, when African Americans said, yeah, you think we're black and that this is something to be ashamed of, that this is a problem. Well, actually, we are black and we're proud to be black. You know, slogans like black is beautiful and the building of black politics, black political mobilization to achieve civil rights, racial equality, to become fully part of American society on equal terms. So that brings us to multiculturalism, which is obviously a political movement, is a political idea. And it seeks recognition, inclusion, and accommodation of the latter, by which I mean the identity from the inside, the identity that people believe they have some sense of. So that, for example, Muslims in Britain may think they're British Muslims, even though other people might think they are Asians or black, or in some cases, Chinese or whatever. So multiculturalism, as it were, endorses and builds on, politically builds on the identity that people think they have, the inside out identity, whilst opposing the imposed identity from the outside, which often, as I've said, is a case of racialization. So that then is what I mean by integration presupposes difference and how it connects to multiculturalism. But let's explore integration a bit further. So I suggest that we should think of integration as having 3 levels. So the first one, to do with everyday cultural encounters. Do people feel integrated in their daily lives, in their neighborhoods, in their workplaces, and so on? And I don't really have anything to say further about that in this talk, but of course, that is one level. Then the next level is what I call sectoral, and here the law can be quite important. Because, for instance, when I talk about this level of integration, I mean people's legal status. Are they citizens? Are they properly treated as citizens? What rights do they have? What opportunities do they have, for instance, in the labor market? How are they treated in the labor market? Is there systemic discrimination, as is often the case, certainly the case in a country like Britain and really all the countries that I'm talking about? Do we see residential concentration because people feel that they're not accepted in other neighborhoods? That's what I mean by this second level of integration. And this is probably the level that policymakers most focus on, and often researchers and sociologists most focus on, though in Britain we've also had a trend in the last couple of decades where quite a lot of sociologists and social research focuses actually on the first level, what is sometimes called everyday multiculturalism, focusing on quite normal, everyday, what's sometimes called quotidian experience. So I'm not going to do either of those. I'm not going to focus on the first or the second, because I want to emphasize the third level, which is now getting some attention, but for a long time got very little attention. I want to argue that there is a kind of macro level, especially a macro symbolic level, and that integration is incomplete without attending to the challenges of that level. And I've got a quote here, as you can see, from Gerard Bouchard and Charles Taylor, two leading Canadian scholars who headed a commission in Quebec. And this quote is from their work in that commission. The symbolic framework of integration, identity, religion, perception of the other, collective memory, and so on, is no less important than its functional or material framework. So I share that view, and that's what I want to emphasize, and I think is at the heart of multiculturalism, and is often neglected by researchers, activists, policymakers, and so on. This macro symbolic level. Of course, the other levels are important, and these levels are interdependent. They hang on each other. That's part of my argument. That's why I think we have to get the macro symbolic right in order to get the other two right as well, for there to be equality and integration at the everyday level and at the sectoral legal level. I suggest that there are at least 4 modes of integration. Often people just think integration means one thing. Well, I certainly want to resist that. So firstly, there's assimilation. I think most people are familiar with that idea, where a dominant society tries to make a minority, in particular a post-immigration minority, become like itself. Assimilation based on sameness, the idea of making people the same as yourself or a dominant group. Then there's individualist integration, or what you might call liberal integration, which doesn't try to assimilate people in the same way, certainly. It allows for cultural differences, but it wants to maintain those cultural differences in what it regards as an appropriately private sphere, not in public life and politics and legal recognition and so on. And it's able to do that partly because it focuses on the individual, on the rights of individuals and on the integration of the individual. And the third level, cosmopolitanism, goes further because it's less interested in citizenship and the national state. It's less interested in the national unit or national citizenship. And so it's more interested in here, cosmopolitanism, basically a Greek word meaning world polity or citizenship of the world. It actually sees national identities and therefore the programs of national integration as the problem, not the solution, because they themselves impose various identities and restrictions upon people who might want to free themselves from those identities, who don't want to be connected to either their minority identity or to their national identity, but want to be free to, as it were, float across identities, to mix identities, and so on. And I suppose that is a kind of multiculturalism. For a lot of people, that's what they actually mean by multiculturalism. But as you can see, I've got multiculturalism as a fourth item, fourth mode of integration, because I want to argue that this is the appropriate kind of multiculturalism for our situation. It's certainly what I mean by multiculturalism, and if it's different to what other people mean, fine. We just need to work out the terms. But I think it's a coherent political idea in its own right. And I'm going to explain it, these four modes of integration, by turning you to a different table here. Just seeing how to do that. Just a minute. Yes, I know. I have to stop share and then share another one. Here we go. Yeah, so this is unpacking the idea of four modes of integration. One of the ways I do this is I say, well, actually, all these four modes of integration, though they're different from each other, they appeal to the same basic political ideas, which I think are central to the idea of citizenship. And these ideas are, as you can see from the very first column, liberty, equality, and fraternity, or what we might today call solidarity. And you'll recognize these are the slogans of the French Revolution, of the original French Republic, liberté, égalité, fraternité. And I think they are central to citizenship, even though I don't share quite the view that French Republican has of them. And I think that all four modes of integration can be understood by reference to these central concepts of citizenship. And this is quite an important idea because a lot of people will say the opposite. They'll say that, for instance, assimilation or individualist integration is about citizenship, but things like cosmopolitanism and multiculturalism are undermining citizenship, or that multiculturalism is some form of relativism and not built on universalistic ideas like liberty, equality, and fraternity. So I want to challenge that view by saying, actually, liberty, equality, and fraternity, central ideas of citizenship, are open to different kinds of interpretations, both in theory and in practice. That's how the world is, that's how it exists. Different countries interpret these ideas differently. And my 4 modes of integration are also 4 different ways of thinking about these core ideas. So quickly, to take you quickly through the table. So as you can see, the first row, I've got objects of policy. You know, who are the units or the targets that these modes are thinking about? So you can see that for assimilation, it's individuals and groups marked by difference. But for individualist integration, it goes further because it focuses also on discriminatory practices of state and civil society. Cosmopolitanism again goes further by adding that we must attend to the ideas. So these are now bringing us to the symbolic level, or what sometimes is referred to as the social imaginaries of us and them. And actually, that too is the focus of multiculturalism. So let's turn then to liberty. What do these 4 modes say about liberty? Well, the assimilationist view is minorities must be encouraged to conform to the dominant cultural pattern. Individualist integration says minorities are free to assimilate or cultivate their identities in private. You know, that's part of their freedom. That's liberty. But are discouraged from thinking themselves as minority. They should think of themselves as individuals or individual citizens. They shouldn't think of themselves as minorities. And this idea is, of course, very strongly found in the French Republican interpretation of liberty, but also sometimes in other liberal interpretations. What about cosmopolitanism? The view there is neither minority nor majority individuals should think of themselves as belonging to a single identity, but be free to mix and match, because the obstacle to freedom, the problem of freedom, is group identities, because group identities, collective identities, tend to be restrictive of individuals' freedoms to mix and match, to be partly of this identity and partly to be other, to be partly Black and partly Muslim, to be partly British and partly European, and so on. Then we get to multiculturalism, and there I say the idea of liberty is that members of minorities should be free to assimilate, to mix and match, or to cultivate, to mix and match, right? So that's like cosmopolitanism. But then I add, or to cultivate group membership, and to be free to do this in proportions of their own choice. So it's up to individuals and groups what elements they want to emphasize of their identities, but groups as well as individuals. Turning now to equality. What are these modes of integration? What do they say about equality? So for assimilation, its presence of difference provokes discrimination and so is to be avoided. Individualist integration says discriminatory treatment must be actively eliminated. So, you know, we have to be active about discrimination, not like assimilation, which just says, oh, let's try and avoid it by not provoking it, by smothering difference. No, individualist integration says, no, we must challenge discrimination so that everyone is treated as an individual and not on the basis of difference. So that's a fairly basic liberal ideal. Cosmopolitanism says anti-discrimination must be accompanied by the dethroning of the dominant culture. So for cosmopolitanism, it's cultures and the ways that cultures can dominate individuals and minorities. That is the core problem preventing equality. And multiculturalism, I say, is that in addition to anti-discrimination, the public sphere must accommodate the presence of new group identities and norms. So insofar as the dominant culture is a problem, it is only a problem if it stands in the way of these two things, that it leads to discrimination in the public sphere, or it prevents the accommodation of new groups and identities and norms. So for multiculturalism, there isn't a problem about there being a dominant culture. By a dominant culture, I mean here something like a majority culture. I don't mean dominant in the sense of domineering. Obviously, that's not compatible with equality. So I mean, as it were, numerically dominant rather than oppressive. And that's, for multiculturalism, I suggest, is only a problem when it stands in the way of, when it creates discrimination in the public sphere, when it's anti-inclusive. And this is a little bit different to what some people define as multiculturalism, because some people define multiculturalism as a society where there is no dominant culture. As it were, all cultures are just free of similar status and perhaps even similar size. And for them, that is an ideal. They don't say it always exists, but it's an ideal of multiculturalism. Whereas my idea of multiculturalism as a mode of integration doesn't posit the ideal that there is no dominant culture. It's what the dominant culture does or does not do in relation to minorities. That's the critical issue in relation to equality, and for that matter, liberty and fraternity. Finally, let's turn to fraternity. So for assimilationism, what we need is a strong, homogeneous national identity. I think we're very, very familiar with this. And in the introductory opening remarks that were made, people talked about monoculturalism and so on. So that's the ideal of assimilationism. For individualist integration, it's the absence of discrimination and the nurturing of individual autonomy within a national liberal democratic citizenship, what you might call civic nationalism or liberal nationalism. That's how people belong together, because they have the same set of rights, you know, a liberal democratic citizenship, and the state defends that, it sustains that. For cosmopolitanism, fraternity means people should be free to unite across, not just within, but across communal and national boundaries, and should think of themselves as global citizens. So if they don't want to think of themselves as Indians or Germans or British or Canadians, well, so be it, it's up to them. There should be no particular pressure to get them to think of themselves in terms of national citizenship. Now, in my view, that is not the multiculturalist views. So my understanding of the multiculturalist view is to be found in that last final box. Citizenship and national identity must be remade to include group identities that are important to minorities as well as majorities. The relationship between groups should be dialogical rather than one of domination or uniformity. So I think multiculturalism is about including group identities, not like the cosmopolitan view of, as it were, dissolving group identities. And as you can see, there's a little note right at the very bottom where I say that in all cases, it is assumed that there is a backdrop of liberal democratic rights and values operate. So the features highlighted that I've just read out from the table are in addition or interaction with them. So I'm talking about integration and multiculturalism here in the context of liberal democratic rights. I'm not saying that's the only way to understand integration or multiculturalism, but that is my context, and that is what I'm theorizing about. So let's get back to the main set of slides, which I'll now do by going back here. So I've now told you what I understand by the different modes of integration, at least 4 of them, and how multiculturalism is one of them, how it's in some ways similar, namely the appeal to liberty, equality, and fraternity, and citizenship, that's the central normative idea, citizenship, and how in some ways it's quite different from each of the other 3 modes of integration. So let's proceed, let's move on. Well, what should be the relationship between multiculturalism and the national? So there is a very strong view derived from Anglo-American liberalism, in particular the philosophy of John Rawls. In fact, it's a dominant view in liberalism today, in academic liberalism anyway today, and perhaps also for some multiculturalists. And that is the idea that multiculturalism, I hope you picked up that MC stands here for multiculturalism, that multiculturalism does not accept the possibility of liberal state cultural neutrality. So the dominant idea I was referring to from Rawls and so on is that the liberal state aspires to be cultural neutral. That's part of the social justice package. In fact, not part of it, at the heart of it, that the liberal state says everyone's free to live their own culture, or what Rawls calls conceptions of the good, as long as they don't try to use the state to impose that on anybody else. And so therefore the liberal state is culturally neutral. I think most multiculturalists don't accept that idea because they think that cultural neutrality is impossible. All states must speak in a language or languages, you know, a limited number of languages, like in India, for instance. In Britain, basically it's British, though we also recognize Welsh, at least in Wales, as a public language. And every country has its own political history, its own political institutions, how they were formed, and how it interprets things like liberty, equality, and fraternity. How we interpret it in Britain is different to how it's interpreted in France, it's different to how it's interpreted in the US, and I dare say it's different to how it's interpreted in India. So the idea of cultural neutrality for the state is an impossible idea and not especially desirable either. Multiculturalism, turning to the next bullet point, multiculturalism works with the idea of multi-level governance of rights, local, national, supranational, but not with the devaluing of national citizenship. Because there has been a move within, broadly speaking, what you might call multiculturalism, especially its cosmopolitan end, which emphasizes the importance of multi-level governance or rights, as indeed I do, and I think multiculturalism should do. But it then thinks that what follows from that is that we should devalue the national citizenship in favor of sometimes the local, sometimes the global, or a combination of both, sometimes referred to as glocal. I don't see that. I think we must value our national citizenship because that's the bedrock and the primary source of our liberty, equality, and solidarity. We would weaken all those concepts, and not just as ideas, but the practice. You know, the social relationships and above all the political and legal relationships that liberty, equality, and solidarity manifest themselves in, if we were to devalue our national citizenship, if we were to weaken our nation states and say, well, national identity, national citizenship, that's not so important. It's just about passports, isn't it? No, it's not. It's got to be a lot more than that. So why it's got to be more than that is that citizenship, as you've already heard me show, is about belonging. Citizens feel they belong to each other, or they ought to feel, because I'm talking in normative terms. So I readily agree that this doesn't always happen. Perhaps, you know, it's imperfect everywhere, and it's far from perfect in some places and at some times. But citizenship ought to be about belonging. We belong to our citizenship, and we belong to co-citizens, to our fellow citizens. And that's why we're concerned about what happens to them. That's why politics is important, why citizenship is important. That's why we have certain kinds of laws and policies and taxes and policies of care, redistribution, and of respect and recognition for minorities. Because when we're all citizens, we aspire to a certain kind of equality and fraternity or solidarity amongst ourselves. But as a legal idea or a political idea, that's not enough. That'll never work just by itself. Most people are not that interested in politics, except, you know, certain moments of time like elections or political crises. And so we need something emotional and imaginative to sustain the idea, this idea that citizenship is about belonging, that citizenship really matters. And I think multiculturalism needs that as well. Multiculturalism can't succeed without people valuing their citizenship. And so what multiculturalism does is to say, well, okay, this emotional and imaginative idea is the idea of our country, is the idea that we have a certain kind of national history, national identity, national membership, national composition, which of course is changing, and that's important, especially to multiculturalism. But then multiculturalism doesn't give up on that or tries to weaken that, but it wants to work with it to make it more multiculturalist. And one of the ways it does this is by it retells the national story so that minorities are included in it. So for instance, when we retell the British story, someone like me can say, yes, I'm part of that story. Britain is not just about an island or an archipelago of Europe. Britain came to India, as well as, of course, other places. It made me and India British. I am part of the British story. And why I'm in Britain, or why my parents migrated to Britain, is part of that British story. So the British story must include telling the story of empire, not just of the island. And of course, the wrongs and the oppressions and the suffering caused by that history, but also how it developed, how ideas about rights and equality developed within that story, and how it needs to be now taken further. As it were, the promise of that story is yet to be realized, and it's still, as it were, a work in progress. It'll always be a work in progress. It would be utopian to think it would ever somehow reach a point where it couldn't be improved. And we retell this national story because we want it to be inclusive, plural, not monocultural, not just about the majority, not just about an elite. And we want it to be forward-looking, i.e. the country we are becoming and want to be, and not just where we're coming from, though of course that's important as well. The story must be told in such a way that it's not stigmatizing. It mustn't stigmatize minorities by telling them they're, as it were, less than British, not fully Indian, somehow only marginally Indian or second-class Indian, or possibly even not Indian at all. That's obviously not a multiculturalist national story. And you know, for liberals, this is sometimes a problem. For cosmopolitans, it's a big problem. There has to be state involvement, state leadership in the telling of that story. Because a lot of people can see the point of, as it were, civil society remaking national identity, you know, having debates, writing novels, creating new works of art, imaginative ways of retelling our national story. By the way, I think one of the most public imaginative ways that I know about in relation to Britain's multicultural story was the opening ceremony of the London Olympics in 2012. Some of you may be too young to even remember it, but I think that was a very imaginative and dramatic way of telling or retelling the British national story. And if you haven't seen that opening ceremony, you should. It's available on YouTube. And of course, we have to bring up a new generation. We have to tell children, we have to teach children what it is to be a citizen in our country. What is our country? And what do we wish it to be? What is our aspiration? So that means schools have to tell some kind of national story. That's why, for all these reasons, the state has to be involved. We have to have political leadership, of course, in a democratic way. So, of course, in a democratic way, but we do need state involvement, because a lot of people say that, what's the problem? What the problem is with national identities is that they're top down. And yes, if they're only or mainly top down, that is a problem. It has to be bottom up as well as top down. But again, this isn't an either or. It must also be top down, because top down means political leadership, politicians, lawmakers, people in public life pointing to the society we want to be, the country we want to be, as well as, so that you might call public education, as well as school and university education and so on. So I think that brings me to my last slide. So I'll call this idea that I'm presenting to you, this mode of integration called multiculturalism, as multicultural nationalism. It's not ideal words. I know nationalism can mean other things for other people. I'm, if you like, trying to contest the term nationalism and show that it can have a multiculturalist meaning. It doesn't always have to be monoculturalist and so on. So multicultural nationalism is a nationalism where there's mutual respect amongst citizens and groups of citizens. There's reciprocity of respect. And there's no absolute privileging of a group in a unilateral way, i.e. unilateral one way. You know, that group just saying, well, you know, we were here first, or we are the majority, or, you know, we are what it means to be properly German, or truly French, and so on. Rather, there should be dialogue, negotiation, mutual adaptation, not just minorities having to change to fit in to so-called integrate. And where this is taking place, we find that there can be a basis for jointly remaking the national identity so that all can have a sense of belonging. This is, of course, an ideal, and some people tell me it's totally utopian, we're a long way away from it. Possibly, I don't think so, in the sense that I can see progress. I mean, there's regress as well. But having come to Britain as a child, I know that the Britain I'm living in today has made progress in terms of pluralizing its national identity compared to all the other decades that I've lived through. Of course, there can be regress as well. Progress is not guaranteed, it's not unilinear. And I think, for instance, the way that Muslims have come to be racialized in the last couple of decades or last quarter century is a kind of regress. It creates a new challenge, a new frontier for multiculturalism, which some people are reluctant to accept. But nevertheless, I have a certain amount of optimism, which is, if you like, my temperament, my politics, but it is based on my experience as well. And the final thing I have on that slide is that in a multinational state, like I would say, like India, like Britain itself, we say, we have 4 units, national type units in our state: England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Like, say, Canada and so on, that in a multinational state, multiculturalism really should be discouraging mono-nationalisms in the same way that it should be discouraging mono-culturalisms. But of course, if it should get to a point that one of the units, say a national minority within the state, wants to separate itself off, well, of course, their multiculturalism has got no view that it should or it shouldn't. Like, say, Scotland wants to be a separate country, and it may well be so in a few years' time. There is, about half the country, half the Scots want it to be an independent state. Well, okay, so be it. Wanting it to be a separate state or not wanting it to be a separate state is not in itself a multiculturalist issue, though, as I say, multiculturalism should discourage mono-nationalisms within the multinational state, like the UK. But what I would then urge is that if Scotland was an independent state, I hope it would be a multiculturalist state. So then we would have to challenge the idea of a single version of Scottishness in the way that we're currently challenging the idea of a single version of Britishness, and which, as I've argued today, is at the heart of the idea of integration, in particular, egalitarian integration. So thank you. That is the end of my lecture, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Modood. Thank you, the people who participated in it. Everyone, it was, at least I think most of you will agree with my assessment that it was a great talk, and we all were given a chance to interact with Professor Modood. We should be very thankful to the Center for the Study of Plural Societies, as well as its founders and those who work in it. Thank you for everyone for making this event a very successful one. Omar, if you want to add something, or should we close it?
I would just like to once again thank you, Professor Modood and Professor Tanweer Fazal, and of course Professor Sonia also. So thank you very much, everyone who have participated. Thank you very much for the CSPS team, which has successfully organized the event. So thank you very much.
Yes, and thank you from me as well. I've enjoyed this session, and I've got to say, this is a lot more interesting than the meeting I'm going to. So bye-bye, everybody, and thank you for attending and participating.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye, and thank you.
Bye-bye.